So medtech meets high tech, privacy, cybersecurity, AI. These are some topics that are exciting to me and hopefully interesting enough to you to keep your attention for about 20 minutes here. So we're going to go pretty rapid fire through this, just given the time and the topic. But I do want to just give a quick background. I've practiced in privacy and cybersecurity for the last 10 years and focused on things like HIPAA, state privacy laws, GDPR, other healthcare compliance matters at the firm. So I've got a lot of experience in connected devices and a lot of the privacy issues associated with that. So we'll talk through what I've seen, some of the things to consider in developing and marketing those products. So we'll do a quick background, go through really briefly some law and regulation. Not a lot of time on that because I think the implications are as interesting as the law, or a lot more interesting than the law. And then we'll talk about just a few deep dives into types of devices and some of the business models and how those variables can really impact strategy and how do we approach privacy and cybersecurity with intentionality, with proactivity to address those issues before we're at the point where contracts are being signed and we're not quite sure why we're signing this contract versus that, or what the provisions that benefit our company are. So we'll get into that in a second. So where are we now? Cybersecurity is enormously significant and important when it comes to connected devices. You can see just from these headlines, which I grabbed from some recent articles, and clearly people are concerned and interested, whether it's patients, customers at hospitals, manufacturers, the government, everyone is interested and concerned about device security, especially when it comes to patients. You know, if a patient's impacted negatively by a device, or if privacy isn't protected with the new kind of trend of wearables, Internet of Things, the kinds of devices that are in your home or on your person throughout the day and tracking you and collecting information. There needs to be a level of trust in those devices and the privacy that they provide, and the protection from, you know, misuse or other things that can happen with cybersecurity breaches. So there's significant concern about that, and it has a big impact on adoption as well of these devices. There's a lot of different types of devices, as you no doubt know. There's plenty of in-home wearables, products that patients keep on their person or around them. There's privacy implications with that we'll talk about. There's durable medical equipment, and there's also even in clinic kinds of devices that can have significant privacy implications, and different angles or issues that can come up as these products are deployed. And then of course software itself on its own can be a medical device, as we know, and that has its own privacy implication and its own concerns, and many times software is mixed with a physical product. So we have kind of cross implications, if you will, between those things. And there's other new innovative types of devices that we're seeing every day. So some of the variables that I think are worth talking about are business model. So you might on the one hand have, you know, a product that's sold to a customer like a hospital or an ASC or some sort of location that provides medical services to individuals, and you're going to have very different contractual relationships and privacy concerns than if you're involved in, say, the DME relationship, where the patient is generally the one signing those agreements with you. So there's differences in that, and whether it's software and you have, you know, sort of ongoing privacy obligations and business associate agreements and other things, you know, that might come with software that's hosted by the company, by the manufacturer, versus, you know, maybe it's software that's sold to and purchased by and then implemented locally by a customer. Beyond that, you know, there's device types that can impact data collection, right? So if you have a DME device that's held, you know, by the patient, maybe it's an insulin pump or some sort of smart device that's worn on the wrist or on some part of the body, those kinds of devices are directly collecting data from the patient, and the company, typically then the manufacturer, is directly involved in handling and managing that data as, in some ways, a healthcare provider. On the other hand, you might have devices that collect data really indirectly, and you have to negotiate those things with a customer. Clinical trials versus commercials, data collection can vary as well, right? If you have informed consent that might broaden and increase the ability to use data. Whereas if you go through more of a commercial model, even your interaction with the patient, through a customer might be challenging and getting data appropriately. So we'll talk about a lot of these things in more detail, but I'll also get into data use, data ownership, and how that's affected by all of these models and variables that can come into play. So a quick summary of law. We'll get through this quickly, but we all know about the HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, focused on covered entities. So we'll briefly talk about that. The Federal Trade Commission Act and how that impacts privacy, and really for manufacturers is maybe one of the most broadly applicable laws because it addresses consumer privacy from a consumer protection standpoint, and really in a sense captures everything that some of these other sector specific or state specific laws do not. We'll talk about state law briefly. That's such a big topic right now, and the trend is extreme in terms of new laws developing, and the implications for manufacturers in this space are incredible. So we'll talk about that briefly. And then the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, of course, has implications for safety and effectiveness of devices, and cybersecurity is really a critical part of safety and effectiveness when we're talking about smart connected devices. So HIPAA, just briefly to kind of highlight why this is really relevant. For the most part, connected devices have a lot of data collection and data processing that happens within the company that provides the device. That's very common. We'll see devices that are at home and the person's on maybe they're a wearable like a monitor, a remote monitoring tool, or a vest or something that collects data. Or we might have in-clinic devices that process data, but maybe even within that there's a cloud connectivity of that device so that the manufacturer is actually processing that data through AWS or through Azure or some other tool, some third-party hosted cloud system that's managed really through the manufacturer. There's so many different ways that data can be collected and processed that HIPAA would address. So that gets into, is the company a covered entity? Durable medical equipment manufacturers often are covered entities in most cases. We also have the potential for business associate agreements, and that's extremely common in the connected device space because once the company starts processing data outside of that kind of in-clinic, in-network customer side, there's going to be an inquiry from that customer saying, you really need to consider signing this business associate agreement with us, or we won't buy your product. So that's important as well. The FTCA, again, just to briefly highlight this, but consumer protection is the key phrase there. And that's all the way from privacy concerns and cybersecurity concerns in terms of fairness, potential deception if you make claims as an organization that we will protect data with HIPAA compliant standards, for example. The FTC is interested in whether you as an organization and a manufacturer are following those promises and making good on those commitments. Along with that, although there's plenty of case law on the privacy and cybersecurity side from the FTC's enforcement actions, AI is beginning to be a key point or a focal point of FTC interest, and they've expressed that through their blogging recently. So if you go to the FTC blog, you can see some explanations or some highlights of things that they might be looking for from an AI perspective. We don't have a lot of case law there yet, but we do have some kind of hints towards we'll be looking at misuse of data. So we've got some case law around that because privacy is implicated when an AI algorithm is developed from personal data. What if that's not consented to properly, or what if there isn't care given to how that data is collected? That can implicate any kind of algorithm if that's involved. Copyright, IP, is data that's being used owned by another party? We could think about generative AI and what are the implications of that if a company uses another company's data to or another person's or organization's data to create an algorithm. So there's quite a few issues that we can dig into there. State privacy laws, I'll just highlight this, but there are over a dozen privacy laws that we've seen come on the books in the past 2 years. And most of them are pretty broad and cover a lot of different ground. For the most part, though, they're targeted at, okay, we have large amounts of data collection online, and how is that managed? So you might see things like threshold numbers of individual data records, from within that specific state. But kind of a recent trend this year, since the Washington My Health My Data Act and a few other kind of copycat laws, we are seeing a trend towards regulating consumer health data. So that's, again, on top of these broader state privacy laws, we're seeing a direct regulation of health information that has fallen outside of kind of direct regulation to this point. For example, HIPAA, so because these laws are targeting that information, they're also restricting things like geofencing of healthcare facilities where services are provided. So trying to protect patient privacy from not only, the broad perspective, but also targeting specific activities that manufacturers or other companies are involved in that can implicate privacy issues. And you can see a list of some of those types of requirements that we're seeing come with those laws. And as you know, FDA is very interested in cybersecurity. Recent guidance finalized just in the past couple of months, so you can take a close look at that as well. So what are some considerations when we're digging into, let's say we're developing a new product that's connected, a smart device? We got to think about cybersecurity. I think that's fundamental. Obviously, safety and effectiveness is key, but also in these connected devices, there's an infrastructure around it. It's not just a device and the security associated with that device. What about the cloud provider that, perhaps an AI system is relying upon to do the diagnostics or monitoring or whatever it is? We need to have awareness of the full infrastructure around that device and do risk assessments, do planning around cyber incidents, what kind of resiliency is in place to make sure that this product continues to work as intended and it protects the privacy of the patients. From a data flow perspective, again, it's everything involved in that particular device. So perhaps you have a programmer that's in clinic, but it uploads data to the cloud. Who is involved in managing that cloud system? Is it a third party? Are there agreements in place to secure the data throughout the life cycle? Understanding all of the data flow implications of that smart device are critical. Understanding the data collection. So devices are going to collect more data as they're implemented. It might have a smart watch, for example, that collects blood pressure information and heart rate and these other things, sleep, add to the list. You can imagine that certain folks who are really interested in the exciting parts of the technology in your organization are also going to want to collect more data and do more things, whether it's in a clinical context or within a commercial context. So really understanding the data collection and keeping updated on that is key. What will you do with the data once it's collected? So anticipate that. What is the business looking to do? Plan for that, carefully. What about patient rights? So do we need consent in order to use data appropriately? Many of these state laws are requiring patient consent explicitly in order to use patient information. And then also, what about contracts and how will that affect ability to use and who owns data? Right now, if you bring a business associate agreement to a healthcare provider that you're selling a product to and say, insert a clause, we are going to own the data, all of it's, our intellectual property, that's probably not going to fly with most healthcare customers in the US right now. But there are probably ways that you can work around that and strategy you can take to address that. So plan for those kinds of issues early on in the process. So just a few things to think about. So let's say you have, we'll go into a couple deep dives on a couple product types. So for example, durable medical equipment, HIPAA covered entities in most cases. So we have immediately to think about all of the privacy implications of that. There are many rules that apply. You have required policies and procedures, security rule, all of those things directly applicable. And of course, with that, you're directly interacting with patients. So what about the consents you might need to address data use, data sharing that's necessary to operate the product. How about the prescriber? What's their involvement? What about data sharing with the prescriber then? So we have to make sure that that's covered with consent, with other engagements with that patient. Who owns the data? Is that something that, are you offering a tool that the prescriber uses? Is it an EHR integration? Different things of that nature can lead to questions about who owns the data that results from this. So a lot of different questions can arise. Remote patient monitoring. This is a little bit different from DME in that usually there's a customer that's a healthcare provider purchasing this product and then deploying it with their patients. So who is the data shared with? Is there a consent mechanism to make sure that, say, a parent or a caregiver in the patient's life is accessing some of that information perhaps? What about with HCP or other involved providers? What about the management of consent? So if the patient does say, I would like this caregiver to be involved in my care, and then perhaps later changes their mind, is there a way to manage those kind of withdrawals of consent or granting of consent in a way that makes sense, right? That can be challenging to manage that. So think about that as you're developing the solution. You can see a whole list of other things, and for the sake of time, we'll kind of just leave that on the screen for you to look at, but there's a lot of considerations in these kinds of products. Implants, think about how does your product go through when you're going to a customer, some of their diligence, right? So in implants in particular, I think about what about the programmer that's typically at the provider? How are you going to explain the security of the device to that provider in a way that convinces them that if I put this in my network at the hospital or at the ASC or wherever it is, that it's actually secure, it won't compromise the systems that I'm dependent on to operate my business. And there are questions more and more about that from customers. Will you have business associate agreements requested? And how will you address that? Will you say, no, we're not a business associate? Or are you going to have to sign those agreements? And how will you navigate that? Kind of thinking about that up front is critical. Really similar issues to kind of the programmer scenario, but again, the security of the device in clinic is going to drive a lot of your discussions with potential customers. Is how can we possibly make sure that this is secure, and then answering in some cases 100 questions about the security of the device in that context. And I'm sure as we develop more, we'll see questions about AI and how that operates within these devices to really try to explain, okay, to a customer, this is how we plan for resiliency and all the other things that come along with reliance on a connected device. Clinical trials, I won't dig too deep into this, but just considering, okay, if we have a connected device, is the company a business associate? Even as it signs, clinical trial agreements, will they also at the hospital or the institution ask us to sign a business associate agreement? Because the company is operating not only as a sponsor and collecting that data through the electronic data capture or some other tool like that, we're also processing clinical data. Is that possible in some of these scenarios as well? Of course, FDA always has a critical eye to safety and effectiveness, so we can't forget about that in all of these device categories. So some quick takeaways here. Again, understand the data flow, so be aware of how the device and the infrastructure around it can manage your to manage cybersecurity, to manage privacy. Those things are important. And then plan contracts and kind of around the business goals of the company. So there have to be some discussions about what are the intended data use implications here. Do we want to do AI, machine learning with this data? Is it something we can do? What are the legal feasible options? Sometimes because of the kind of variables in the device model and business model, we won't be able to use data the way we want to. So how do we flexibly approach that? Are there some changes we can make early on before it's too late to make those changes? Of course, patient consent, what kind of approach will you take? Who's responsible for that? Planning for that. And then look at all of the ecosystem cybersecurity wise and be prepared to deal with privacy and cybersecurity kind of safety and effectiveness issues. Then be flexible. This is a rapidly changing area of law. So there is a lot to consider, and you might be halfway across the stream in terms of development and realize there's some new legal issues to deal with, new state laws, and potentially new federal law in the future. So we'll always be flexible. So that concludes a quick recap on privacy around all of these things.